I should tell you, I was born and raised in Minnesota, and outside, I finally got done with school just a little bit before. Well, my kids are still in school, but when I'm not doing demography, I'm driving in my minivan. So if you see someone jetting around from soccer game to soccer game, that's me. I want to share with you what the big demographic changes are that are going to unfold over the time period that you'll be looking at when you're thinking about your plan for this community going forward. And there are some really tremendous changes that will have big impacts on this community, that will have big impacts on our businesses, on our workplaces, our institutions, our governments, and so I want you to get a sense of the timing and scope of those kinds of changes, because I think that it will contextualize the plan that you'll be making. I should say that I think with this size, and you all seem, chatty enough that I can take questions as we go. That's just fine. I had planned for some time at the end for questions. We can do that too, but if you have questions about what I'm talking about as I go and I'm not being clear, feel free to stop me and ask me as we go. Okay, so I want to talk about those big demographic trends that are impacting the state, that will be impacting Shoreview from kind of the larger levels. Then we'll look specifically at how Shoreview has changed in recent years and what we're likely to see going forward. I want to give you a brief commercial for Census 2020 because it's something that I'm already working on. And then, as I said, there'll be time for comments and questions at the end. So, if you're a demographer, you have to talk about aging. Aging is the big trend. And so I want to give you a sense of what that looks like. I know you all have heard that this is a big deal, and you know that it means something to our future. I want to give you a sense of just how big of a deal that is and what it might mean going forward. So if you look here at the last 6 decades, this is for the state overall. This is telling you how many more older people we had each decade. And you can see in the 1950s, we had about 85,000 more older adults, people aged 65 and older, than we had in the decade prior. So it's always been between about 50,000 and 90,000 additional older adults each decade. That's how we were growing. So what do you think it's going to look like this decade? Don't guess lower. That was a terrible guess. It's higher. So we will add to the state, this is just Minnesota, about 300,000 older adults. This decade, we're already in 2017, right? So we're already well into that first green bar. And on top of that, we'll add another 300,000 during the 2020s. And this is something that we can project pretty easily because we take censuses. The Census Bureau takes censuses and has surveys. My predecessor, who was in this role before me, used to like to tell people that we have this theory as demographers that we think people age about 1 year every 12 months. I draw this out to say that this stuff isn't hard to predict. We know who's living here now. What's happening is people are already here and they're aging into place. So this is another way to think about this. This again is the state. If you think of this graph like an escalator, and down here are our youngest, our cutest residents down there at the bottom. And if you think about every 5 years, everyone moving up a bar, every 5 years, everyone moving up a bar, you can see that baby boom generation in their 50s to early 60s is just set to move above that 65-year-old age mark. And so that's what's creating that aging trend. It's going to be important for a number of reasons. One of the things that's going to change very soon here in the next year or two is that we're going to have more older adults in the state than we have school-aged children. I don't think that it means that there's going to be like a bell that goes off that says, bing, 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 we're there. We're a different age structure now. But I'm showing you that there are these 3 lines here because these are the main budget drivers at the state level. These are the people that consume the most public goods and services in terms of if you could just pick demographic groups by age. The blue line are people who are in higher ed, post-secondary school, and you can see that that number is going to be pretty steady. That 65 mark, you can see that's what we were looking at before, a slightly different one, the yellow line there. And the green line is going to be the school-aged children. So why does that matter? Well, maybe it doesn't matter too much, but if you're thinking about how we deliver services and how we pay for services, we're going to have to think about how we realign what we have going forward in terms of meeting the demands of the people that we do have. It looks like I have lost my category-wide name values. But let me tell you, this was to be just to give you a general sense of how we spend money at the state level. In this gray bar, can't you see it? It's K-12 education. I'm surprised you can't read that. We have health and human services over here. And we have, this is higher ed down here. And then public protective kind of services, police, the state patrol and so forth. And then this is everything else here. So what do we do if we have a big proportion of the pie that's going to need to expand because we have more people who are going to need health care? That's the health and human services pie. What does that do to all other areas of the pie? I don't know that it's a zero-sum kind of a game, but I do know that we're going to have to figure this out, and we don't really have an answer at this point in time about how things are going to kind of shake out as these pressures on the budget continue to grow. I should have mentioned, I forget to mention sometimes that I'm not a political appointee. I'm in a nonpartisan position, a civil service position with the state. And so I only show this to you not to say that there should be one priority of spending over another. I just show it to you to say that there's some work that we're going to have to do in order to figure out how we are going to afford the care of our older adults, continue to educate our young people, because our demographics are going to change whether or not we're ready for them to change with respect to age, and we'll have to kind of figure out what we do in response to those changes. One of the biggest pressures on the budget will be coming through the need for long-term care for older adults. How do we afford to care for people who are reaching the ages of 75, 80, 85 and need additional supports to stay in their homes, or maybe in institutional care? We do know that we expect the budget pressure just because of the care of older adults will grow. And the reason why I'm drawing this all out about aging, I thought we were going to talk about fun stuff like our community tonight, is that I want you to understand that going forward, there's likely to be budget pressures just because of aging. So the kinds of things that we should be thinking about going forward are going to have this in mind, that there's a cost restraint likely that we haven't fully experienced recently. We've had years where there have been budget deficits, of course, and then we've had good years. But this is going to be more or less a long-term pressure on the budget that we'll have to kind of figure out as we go. We'll have to realign to this new demographic reality. And this is true of Minnesota. This is true at the US level. This is just something that lies ahead of us. And so when you're thinking about your comprehensive plan to 2040, this is going to be a big piece of the backdrop of that, is that you'll have a very different funding kind of ecosystem than you had going in on this side of the trend. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Are those numbers based on the current healthcare framework, or do you also have to factor in any possible changes due to the political changes?
No, this is just if we were to, this is just if we were to provide services at the same level that we currently are. So there are things we could do like make it more efficient. This is just if we put the same, the increased number of people through the same system, this is what we would get. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to look at this number. There's probably cost-saving measures. We've already done a lot here in the state to reduce the cost, to help people stay in their homes as long as possible. That's a win-win oftentimes, because people want to stay in their homes as they age for the most part, and it's less expensive for the state if that happens, or for the federal government as well. But this is just to give you a sense of the size of the growth to 2040 that we're talking about. And there isn't right now a plan in place to address this change. There just isn't. I can say politically, as a nonpartisan person, that on one side of the aisle, one group says, well, we have to cut because this is getting out of hand. And another side of the aisle says, well, we have to keep up with it because these are people who need care. So I think we have some way to go in just continuing that conversation to make progress on that conversation. But this will be the backdrop to all of the work that we do, to how healthy our communities are, to how healthy our schools are. Aging isn't just about aging, it's also about, from birth all the way up through working years, through our schooling systems and beyond. Did I bring you all down? You're like, why'd you have to start with aging? I love this topic, actually. So we're already well into this transition. I've been talking about aging as if 65 is like the point beyond which you're an older adult. That's not true. I only do that kind of to simplify the trend when I'm talking about the numbers. But right now what we have is a lot of people who are moving into the retirement years. They're just moving out of work and just moving into retirement. And when we talk about that long-term care stuff, that's a ways out. Because the first boomer doesn't turn 80, which is kind of when you get more need for long-term care, for another, till 2026 or something. So we have a little bit of time there. Where we're feeling the aging trend right now is definitely with respect to our workplaces and what we see in terms of the labor market. This is a graph that scares a whole heck of a lot of business owners, and let me tell you what it's telling, why that is. What happened in the past, because we had a growing working age population, is we could always count on the number of workers in Minnesota to grow pretty rapidly and to grow faster than the jobs that we had. What we're seeing now is very, very little growth in the working age population. We project that over the next 5 years, we'll only add about 7,000 additional workers to the state of Minnesota each year during that 5-year period. And we're used to something much closer to 35,000 a year, or 20,000 a year. So we're used to this ever-expanding pool of potential workers, and what we're going to see going forward is very, very little growth. This is important when you're thinking about your community and the vitality of your businesses, because it has become and it's going to continue to be pretty hard to find workers. We're starting to see, we've been seeing it maybe for 3 or 4 years now, just a whole lot of help wanted signs everywhere, even in retail, but it's really across the board that people are having a hard time finding the workers that they need, and that can be tough for businesses to grow in that kind of condition, under those kinds of demographic conditions. That's happening because there are so many baby boomers who are moving into retirement, There's a lot of millennials moving into the labor force, but it's just not enough to both make up for the baby boomers leaving and then also grow on top of that. So there's economic repercussions for this, from this aging trend as well. We expect going forward that the potential to dampen economic growth really could be there. And so that's you know, that potentially could be a problem too, kind of on top of the costs of aging that we just talked about, is that it could potentially dampen growth as well. But the good news is that we do have growth from new communities in Minnesota. We are becoming more diverse racially, culturally, religiously, ethnically, lots of different ways. And here in Minnesota, you can see the overall trend. The groups that have been growing the fastest have been the Black or African American Minnesotans, Asian Minnesotans, and Hispanic or Latino Minnesotans. Those are the groups that they've grown roughly at the same rate over the last 25 years, since about 1990, where we've really seen kind of that inflection point. And they're roughly the same size if you look at the state level. That's really where most of our growth has been coming from. If you look between the last two censuses, demographers think in census terms. If you look between 2000 and 2010, populations of color in the state accounted for about 85% of the state's growth. So it's a real, and not every state has this. So I say, given kind of the aging trends that I just laid out for you, we are experiencing growth among populations of color and among new Minnesotans as well. You can see here that there's been an increase, a little bit of an uptick in immigration. Here in Minnesota is the blue line, where about 8% of our state is foreign born. And the green line. The blue line is the US at about 14%. And so we've seen this little bit of an uptake, but as you'll note, it's the level of foreign born, the percentage of foreign born is nowhere near what it was if you extend that graph all the way back to 1850 as we have here. So we've experienced a little bit of a change since about 1970 with respect to immigration. But it doesn't look at all like it looked like when 40% of the state was foreign born. Yeah?
Could you go back one slide?
Sure.
Maybe one more.
Yep.
Is there something, do you know what's driving that? Is it regional? Is it Minnesota? Is it all states? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
What's driving it?
A lot of it has to do with migration, with international migration. So that really picked up around 1990, especially from Mexico. But you can see here in Minnesota that wasn't all of it. That kind of darkest, it's hard to distinguish. This line here is Hispanic or Latino. And you can see it's leveled off just a little bit there recently. So I would say primarily what's happened is there's been an uptick since 1990 in international immigration. But then the people who migrate tend to be in their 20s, younger people, and so they tend to have children, and then you get this kind of momentum that happens.
I'd like to think that Minnesota is a fabulous place to come and live. We know.
Well, that's true.
Compared to Wisconsin or North Dakota or Michigan, just curious.
Yeah, I would say that the states that have metropolitan areas like we do have similar levels of immigration that we've experienced here. If you look at a state that doesn't have a big metro that's largely rural, you won't see that same level of immigration. It's really kind of a metro phenomenon. What's different here in Minnesota is that we have a slightly higher proportion of the people who are coming from other countries that are refugees. And we also have a slightly higher proportion coming from Africa than elsewhere. So that's kind of our unique immigration mix here in Minnesota. You look at a city like many of the cities in Texas, for example, and you see much higher levels of immigration, much more heavily Latino as they're closer to Mexico. We tend to see pretty evenly from all around the globe, which is kind of our unique demographic, I guess. Are there other questions? Okay. So part of what I think is happening with respect to part of why I know we're going to become more diverse going forward is because if you go younger, you have more racial diversity. The yellow proportion of these lines here show you that, of our kids 0 to 4 years old, about 70% are white, and if you look at the very top, 85 plus here in Minnesota, about 96% are white. So when you have a more diverse group in this range who are having babies, then you kind of fuel that diversity at the younger ages as well. That's just how it works. So it's partly because of immigrants coming from around the globe, and it's also due to just who the young people are, who are the people who are of parenting age. Okay, the last big trend that I want to share with you is just that there's been a shift in terms of urban growth versus suburban and exurban growth. And that's something that demographers have been watching, not only in Minnesota, not only in the Twin Cities, but really across the US. And what I want to draw your attention to is this line here, which is Hennepin and Ramsey counties together, which typically kind of trailed the state, at least, along with greater Minnesota. It trailed the state, but recently, since the recession, it's increased and now is, I stepped right into the light, is now leading the state in terms of growth. And what's more, it's not only Hennepin and Ramsey County in total, but it's Minneapolis and St. Paul that have seen a tremendous amount of growth in just a very short period of time. So that's kind of a new phenomenon for us, but as I said, we're not alone. That's been happening in a lot of the metro areas. What we're seeing in some metro areas, but not here yet, is we're beginning to see more and more growth out in the inner ring suburbs. And we would expect that would happen going forward here as well. Yeah?
What's your definition of exurban?
Well, in my case, the exurban is Carver, Chisago, Asante, Scott, and Wright. We did it based on growth, kind of what counties have kind of grown together in a similar way historically. But say when other research institutions have looked at that, they've looked at both density and growth rates and kind of grouped people that way. But in this way, it's a strict county by county. And here we have Anoka, Dakota, and Washington as the suburban counties in yellow there. So what we were doing in Minnesota in the past, for many, many decades, was growing outward from Minneapolis and St. Paul, right? The Twin Cities growing outward, another ring, we grew outward, another ring, we grew outward. Well, what happened since the recession is that growth has reversed. And we've seen this tremendous spike again in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The question is, will we continue to see that growth going forward, or will we see it kind of even out across the metropolitan area again? Yeah?
Is this just a spike in the, say, last 5 years? Recently, I read some Met Council reports. 76% of the population lives in the suburbs and out in the 7-county metro area.
Yeah.
And the remainers in the central cities. 70% of the jobs are out in the suburbs, and et cetera. And 30% of the jobs are in the central cities. Is that reversing in the last couple of years? Is Met Council data out of whack?
I would say what we have seen is pretty robust growth across the 7-county metropolitan area. I'm talking about people growth now, not job growth. And that we still have, of course, a very large metropolitan area relative to Minneapolis and St. Paul. But what's been unique, what's been really the change is that the level of growth in Minneapolis and St. Paul hasn't been anywhere near what it has been in the last 5 years for decades. It's been a true reversal. If you look at the people who have moved into Minneapolis and St. Paul from some of the data, it's people who are 23, 24, 25, really concentrated in some area, the lofts, right? The warehouse district, really concentrated. So the question isn't, are these people going to stay there forever? I think it's unlikely that as these young people, millennials, continue to kind of move through their lives, that they'll want to remain renting if they have a choice, and that they'll want to remain in some of those kinds of living conditions once they begin to have children. It's a question mark, I guess. I would just say that what we see of young people right now isn't necessarily a preference that they'll hold with them all the way through their lives. They're changing people too. There's another question.
Yeah, that's what I understand. Is millennials are moving to the downtowns because there's a lot to do there.
There's stuff to do there.
Fun.
Yeah.
And then there's also the empty nesters, older adults. They're also moving downtown for the same thing. They want access to, the theater and music and all that kind of thing too.
Yeah.
Both age groups.
Yeah.
Contribute to that.
Yeah. And when you think about how to build a community for older folks, I was just showing you the aging trend. Many of the same things that you would do for, almost all of the things that you would do for older folks, apply across the age spectrum. So it's not like we're building cities specifically for a demographic and then we're going to grow out of that demographic or something. It's being close to things, having transportation that's accessible. It's having, a grocery store nearby. Oftentimes it means walkable as you age. And so I don't think it necessarily has to be located in the very center cities, but it has a lot of those amenities that I think are popular among our two largest age groups right now. Yeah.
I see for regional cities that Duluth hasn't grown very much.
No, you're right. Duluth hasn't grown very much. We have had, in the very darkest blue is where we see the most amount of growth, at least in numeric terms. But even if we were looking at percentages and looking at Duluth alone, not all of St. Louis County, there just hasn't been a lot of growth there. That's not true of all of our regions. So we've seen a good amount of growth in Rochester, in Mankato. That slowed down a little bit now, but in Moorhead, you can see the blue square up here is the Fargo-Moorhead area. And Rochester is down here. So it's not only a Twin Cities phenomenon. I've been talking about the Twin Cities because that's where we are now, but we are seeing growth in many of our regions. Not Duluth, though. Not Duluth.
Your demographics, is there other outlet shows where employment opportunities are by county? Because if my guess is my guess, that will overlap that.
Yeah.
And like he's a fellow who basically has to buy Duluth for the state of Minnesota for almost 40 years. Duluth has been a dying town since I've been in high school.
Yeah.
That's a long time ago. And I know that jobs have disappeared there, but I'm a little surprised that Clay County, Moorhead is adding jobs, not Olmsted, but going up the river to Stearns County, and even Wright County is a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, so this is, you're right. The population growth often happens mostly happens where there where there are job opportunities. And in the gray areas, many of these areas are the rural areas of our state that haven't been able to sustain the same level of jobs that they once did. And so, of course, jobs is a real driver of some of these population changes. Part of what's happening in terms of the growth that we see, part of the regional pattern that's happening that's bucking the trend is that in some of the lakes areas of northern, not quite northern Minnesota, but north of the Twin Cities where you have a lot of the lakes, you see a lot of growth there. Recreational growth. So we see people moving to the lakes areas, particularly after retirement. And that's bucking that trend of kind of the rural areas growing.
Driver license data to come up with that?
This is based on census,
Census.
Yep, yep. No, not driver's license data, we don't use that.
And county on it.
Yeah. We've tried to use address data for a few things, and it's a little tricky because people don't always update their addresses or their driver's licenses quickly, not until you have to. So, yeah, not until you have to. So these are the big demographic trends that are going to kind of be the backdrop for the planning work that you do. They're kind of inescapable. When I'm saying they, I'm talking about the aging trend. This is really what we are going to experience, and it's going to have its tentacles in public budgets, institutions, in individual communities. But we're starting from a really great place. You shouldn't be able to read this, but I just want you to know it's a whole bunch of ranking lists that tell you that Minnesota is coming from this big challenge from a place of relative strength. So we have a high proportion of people with a bachelor's degree or higher. We have a low percentage without health insurance. We have a low poverty rate, still 10%, but it's low relative to other states where you rank third, lowest. We have high economic output. We're a little bit lower there, but still almost top 10 in 2015. We have a civically engaged population. So we've got all these things going for us, and many other states are in the same boat. They're going to be experiencing many of these same changes. And so it's just a matter of thinking about how do we work together? How do we do our best thinking to realign with the demographic realities that are unfolding in front of us? Okay, I'm going to share with you what Shoreview has looked like. That's kind of the big demographic backdrop. And I want to share with you what we've seen in terms of growth in this city and its peer cities now to kind of get you thinking about that. I would say that the growth is best characterized in Shoreview, and this is really, typical of communities around this area as very stable population. So if you're looking at that top level number of total number of people who live here, you've seen a little bit of growth in the past 5 years or 6 years. But it's really pretty close to what that number was in 2000. So really stable overall. I mean, it's really largely built out, right? Shoreview's largely accounted for. Everyone has their parcel, right? And so you wouldn't expect to see some of that kind of other growth where they're still kind of moving outward in some of the communities that I'll show you in a minute. I've added the Met Council's projections here, but I can't speak specifically to the details of those projections, but I just wanted you to know when you're planning for your community going forward, that same level of population is likely to be pretty stable going forward, is kind of the takeaway that I take from that. Even though you may be seeing new housing units being built, it doesn't always mean that the population follows with that. And I just wanted to point that out, that between 2000 and 2010, Shoreview had a declining population even though you had more households. And that's kind of another thing that happens when you have an aging community, because you have young people who are moving out of the household, smaller household sizes. So even though there's growth in the number of dwellings that you have here in Shoreview, it may or may not follow that the population is also growing. But you can see that there's been really pretty robust growth in the last 6 years right here in Shoreview, adding about 1,300 people, which is more, you know, that there was negative population decline over the decade of 2000 to 2010. So it's a reversal since that time. Now, just to give you a sense of what your neighbors look like, you can see that Blaine here is up ahead. Shoreview's right here. And there's a bit of an inflection. It's kind of hard to see, but it is increasing a bit, and that looks pretty similar to Roseville. Lino Lakes looks like it's leveled off a little bit. But it does look to me like we're talking about a stable population, at least when we're talking about the total numbers. Yeah?
Do you see any differences in areas that have higher ranked school districts when there's an aging population and perhaps 3 and 4 bedroom, greater proportion of 3 and 4 bedroom homes, that there's a market for that home and therefore a replacement with younger families?
I think that has been true, absolutely, that a school district has been a really important piece of why people move to a community, especially for people of a certain age, for families of a certain, you know, point in their life cycle. That has been the kind of conventional knowledge up to this point, that you'll continue to see growth when you have a robust school district and you see school districts that are struggling and young families moving out of those school districts. I don't think it necessarily has to follow going forward that we'll see this, and we've seen so many changes in just the last 10 years. If you think about the generation now who is kind of moving into home ownership, who's moving into maybe starting a family, people who are in their maybe late 20s, early 30s, we are still seeing those folks moving into home ownership at a slower rate than we saw in the past. We're seeing delayed childbearing among young people, people in their 20s. That's continued, so that we're seeing very low birth rates historically here in Minnesota. And so you may not have that same pull as the school district. And the other thing that's kind of up in the air now that maybe wasn't in the past is that you have different amounts of wealth, of resources of your younger generation. So you have a larger mix of people maybe who came from another country. Maybe they don't have the same kind of wealth networks as people who were born here. You have college debt. So there's a lot of, you know, I would say that that's a real asset to have a school district that's strong, but the pool of people that may be in the market for that school district may have changed. And I can't say exactly, give you a number on that because I haven't ever tried to do that kind of projection. But there's a lot of stuff that's kind of up in the air right now, and those are some of the factors. Yeah.
When you say peer cities, are you just meaning ones close by? Because I look at Blaine's numbers and I just think Blaine has room to build.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. This is only about who's sharing your borders. It's not at all, it's a geographic border, not at all, it's not more nuanced than that. I just wanted you to see how your neighbors that are nearby are growing, and you can see that there's really stable populations in a lot of these communities that are nearby. Unlike Blaine, that, as I said, has that room to grow and has that momentum. And yet, Shoreview really has grown a considerable amount. If you look at just the change, that's the 1,300 there. Those dots are showing you the percentage change, if you wanted to see it that way. But I just wanted to give you, for context, I talked about Minneapolis and St. Paul earlier, that if I line up Minneapolis and St. Paul and the growth that's happened there in the last 6 years, those numbers are far outpacing even Blaine, right? So you see Blaine just kind of look like it shrunk down. Again, the question is, are those folks going to stay in Minneapolis? Are they going to stay in those lofts, in those rental units? Are they going to want to move into home ownership? There's no reason to think that just because people are young, they don't want that financial stability and wealth building that home ownership brings, right? It just hasn't been in the cards for this huge generation yet. We're starting to see movement toward homeownership, so I would expect that we'd continue to see that playing out. For a community like Shoreview, the question is, what is attractive about Shoreview for people who are exactly in that big cohort of movers? Again, is it the schools? Is there a large enough cohort that you can draw, or group that you can draw from elsewhere in Minneapolis and St. Paul, from abroad, from other places around the U.S.? Where exactly are you going to kind of find that growth as you continue to move forward? I just want to give you a sense of how Shoreview has changed in the last 30 years. And I'm showing you again one of these age graphs, your youngest, cutest residents there at the bottom. I showed you those 2 green lines because they're your biggest cohorts in 1990. And then in 2000, this is what I'm talking about. It's not so hard to project, folks. And then in 2010. So you have your biggest cohort. These are the census numbers that I just showed you. The biggest cohort of folks aging in place, aging in Shoreview, into right now, early 50s up to about mid 60s are those big cohorts. You want to see it again? I'm showing it to you again if you want to see it or not. So the question is, that's just kind of a visual, is as those folks age, what kind of community will Shoreview be? I can say that when there have been surveys of older adults in Minnesota, the vast majority want to stay in the community that they're already living in. Many want to move housing units because of the size or some other physical feature of the house that they're in. But the vast majority of people want to remain in their communities. And so the question is, will you have the amenities to support this aging population, and then also, as we said, attract people into these younger age groups as well. I just wanted to point out that this is Ramsey County now, but the way that we're growing is still largely because of births, but that international migration is a tremendous part of how we grow. This is just in 6 years, Ramsey County added about 20,000 new immigrants to the county, people who came from abroad, and lost about 10,000 people from Ramsey County to other places in the U.S. So that's been a tremendous amount of the growth that's happened. And births has been an important piece of that too. It's still the leading. But as we age, immigration will continue to be a really important part of growth.
What do we know about the educational level of the international immigrants?
In Minnesota, it's been really split. So you have a lot of people at the high end, a high proportion of people with master's degrees, PhDs with applied degrees, bachelor's degrees or higher, and then you have a large proportion also at the very low end of the education spectrum. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a large proportion of our immigrants who are refugees, who have often come from countries where you don't have the same educational opportunities back home. And you also have a high proportion of economic immigration, at least historically, from Mexico. That's really leveled off in the last 10 years. But you really see at the two ends, really highly educated on the one hand, and less so on the other, less in the middle. Yeah. Okay, here's my census commercial. It's going to be super fast. It's coming. It's going to be really important because it is not only about data, which you can tell by now that I like okay, but it also will determine how much political representation we have in Congress. We're kind of teetering on the edge of losing a congressional seat, and so it's going to be super important for us to count everyone who's here. It's also important because the money that we get from the feds is oftentimes based on formulas, our census count formulas. So it's coming. I'm working on it now, and you will be hearing about it more soon. Okay, that's what I wanted to tell you. It's a lot, but I have to tell you this. There are big changes ahead. I mean, I think the aging trend in particular is the one that has the potential to really disrupt a lot of the things that we've built, the structures that we've built, the budgets that we've built, public institutions. A lot of these things that we've kind of been humming along just fine for many, many years now are headed into toward big changes, I think. And I am optimistic about that because I think that there is no reason why we can't put into place better institutions for this demographic reality that's kind of unfolding in front of us. There's no reason why we can't dream up something that works better for more of us. So despite the fact that it may look scary that there's lots of changes coming up, that there's uncertainty in public budgets and how we'll care for people, I think there's no reason to think that we can't figure this out. We're really in a very good position to be able to do that. As I showed you all our great stats, I think there's a new one coming, a new ranking list that comes out each week almost that we're toward the top of. And so I think we're really in a good position to be able to handle some of these challenges that are ahead of us. Yeah?
How do you feel about the investment in the metro area? Seemingly, we have poured a lot of money into the central cities, which has perhaps resulted in people who should be congregate in those central cities because we put transit in.
Oh.
We put the Viking Stadium, the Twins, and all kinds of things along that corridor there, rather than we had an opportunity for Arden Hills to have the Vikings and the city communities that be in central cities, and the power made that happen there, you know. So do you invest all your resources in central cities and not put transit, not put the effort out in the
further out? I would say that for the population that I see going forward, the aging population, that transit is going to have to play a bigger role across the region, that it's not just for young people. It's going to be increasingly important going forward. Maybe, but we also have all kinds of innovations coming on the scene, right? What's going to happen when we really do have self-driving cars? That would have sounded crazy 10 years ago to say that sentence in front of you all, but it appears to be, you know, a real potential, a real reality going forward. And so it is hard for me to get my head around exactly what the infrastructure should look like to accommodate our future. We do know that the people, by and large, will be older, that our communities will stay older, and so that transportation that works for older folks is going to be an important piece of this. whether it's, transit or if it's roads that can support our self-driving cars while we look at our phones. Yeah.
On national news, there was a while ago, but I know we've seen it in the state, where younger people aren't getting driver licenses right away in high school. And I know there's a variety of reasons for it, having come from the division that issued the dark lanes. But how does that play out now, and how do your numbers? Because if you don't have a driver license, legally you can't drive, although some people, they ignored that little fine part, but it does drive how you get from home to work, work to home, and your other travels, say, to the grocery store and that.
So the question is how
does driver license debt, in terms of younger people not driving,
I guess,
affect some of this stuff as to
Yeah.
where we live,
Yeah.
where we work?
It's a good question. I think that, first of all, I would say that what we see in terms of the behavior of young people, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, what we see isn't necessarily an expression of the preference. It may just be indicative of the economic circumstances that they find themselves in. What we've seen for young people coming out of college up until very recently, probably the last 5 years, is a tremendous amount of difficulty finding footing in the labor market. Really hard, tough, coming out of the recession, it was impossible for young people, even coming out of college, to find good paying jobs. And so with college debt, the thought of the expense, the added expense of a car and of insurance was out of reach for a larger proportion. Now, I think what we've been seeing in the last 5 years with some of those labor numbers those worker numbers that I shared with you, is that there has been much more opportunity for young people, and so I would expect that we would see some of that creating an uptick in drivers, in young drivers, but you still, you change preferences with the experience that you have.
I know millennials have moved downtown, they rent the lots because either they don't drive or they want to drive, they don't want to pay for a car. They live in areas where you don't need a car. If on occasion you do, they just rent those power cars.
Yeah.
So they avoid the whole cost of
Yeah.
automobiles.
And
So there's kind of places like in Seattle and Amazon, they build apartments just for employees.
Yeah. And I would say that works for young people who are in their 20s, who are renting, who are working nearby. It may work less as those same folks move into having families.
That moves on to my question.
Yeah.
In a neighborhood like Shoreview, which is obviously aging, we're going to have more and more residents who want to age in place.
Yeah.
Are there any cities or communities that you would recommend looking at that you know have done a good job in supplying amenities to those who want to age in place? You can look at.
I would say that there's a project called Communities for a Lifetime that looks at what are the features of a community that's good across the whole lifespan, including older age. And so, again, many of the things that are good for people in their 20s are also a good thing for people who are aging. Transportation, housing, affordable housing, good transportation, walkable streets, some level of accessibility and some level of density tends to kind of pop up among those lists of things that are good for people who age. And that doesn't mean that the housing would have to be dense, but just that the amenities and access to them, I think, would be kind of in that list. Dakota County has been pretty active in this Communities for a Lifetime initiative, and so they have a nice website that kind of lay out what exactly communities that are good for older adults might look like and what amenities they might have. So that that would be a good place to start looking. Yeah.
I'm curious, obviously we're largely developing Shoreview and we're looking at demographics and we're seeing these trends. Do you make recommendations to, say, the Planning Commission about what kind of changes or development may need to happen?
My role typically has been kind of big picture stuff. So I lay out what I know is going to happen with a lot of certainty with respect to some of these trends. And then I haven't gotten so involved in those specifics other than to say that this aging thing's a certainty, increased diversity is a certainty, and there's a lot of other things in between that are likely to change. So I would say that your planners, your city planners, would be the people who would really have policy recommendations for the demographic changes that you're likely to see. Yeah.
Is it possible from a demographic standpoint, with the baby boomers getting older, that cities would tend to overcompensate for an aging population? And once that bubble's gone, what's going to happen as the younger population starts to age and if you go even further?
Yeah, so it's tricky. Let me tell you two answers that completely contradict each other. It's going to make you happy. Statewide and at the bigger levels, the larger levels of geography, what's happening, and this is a state level graph again. What will happen into the foreseeable future for the state of Minnesota is that we will become older and stay older from here on out. So it's the baby boomers helped us along, helped this transition along to an older state, but we were going there anyway, and we were going to stay there and into the foreseeable future. That's what happens when you live a long time and you don't have a lot of children. And we have long life expectancies here, and we have low birth rates. And so eventually what that gets you is a relatively older society. If you think about Japan, if you think about Italy, if you think, you can think of many different countries that have already kind of undergone this transition. So at the state level, kind of in terms of are we going to overbuild? I think we're going to be older for the foreseeable future. That's not an issue. At the city level, at the community level, for some counties, that really could become an issue. Because where will the alignment be? And will the people who move into Shoreview, as the baby boomers age out of Shoreview, will they be able to afford it? Will they find it attractive? Will they, what are the amenities that you have to continue the growth of the younger ages is really the question. So again, just looking at this aging trend, the question will be, well, you don't really want to build for this group right in their 70s and 80s, at least not to that level, because you know that it's unlikely to see that same level. The Generation X is super small. If people who are in their 40s, it's a really small share of the state, and in many communities, that's our smallest generation. And so if you're building exclusively for a group that would only be attractive to that one age demographic, that potentially could be a problem. So you need to be thinking about these flexible uses of housing, what might be attractive to a broad range of folks, a broad range of income levels, because there's a lot of uncertainty coming up and you don't know exactly how Shoreview shakes out, given all these different patterns that are happening. So thinking about broad general uses of housing, of transportation modes, what's attractive to people across the lifetime, is a really nice way to kind of buffer against any overbuilding or underbuilding for any particular age group. I think it probably doesn't make sense to build just for one demographic. Yeah. Yeah.
There are things the community can do within a community, as opposed to a bigger state, to affect that. For example, in our area, the school is very highly rated. The schools are.
Yeah.
The schools are. And so people are trying to do whatever it takes to get into the district. And so that keeps the bubble coming from the bottom.
It's a huge asset, yeah.
It's had no open enrollment for years now. And they look at their future and they look at your demographic data. It looks like they're going to be that way for foreseeable.
Yeah.
So that affects, that keeps the bubble from happening in any one age group, because you keep constantly bringing people in. So otherwise you might say that, well, the boomers built too big a house, or too big a house,
Yeah.
and whatnot, no one can afford it. But yet people find a way to get in because they want to get in for the schools. Maybe if that's absent the schools, they might say, no, that house is too big, I won't move it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right in terms of it's a huge asset to have schools that are strong, that people are coming to. And I was honestly dropping my kid off at soccer yesterday and talked to a dad that moved to this area just for the schools. And he was dropping his kid off at soccer in St. Paul. So I know anecdotally that happens. You all know that happens because you live in this community, and many of you probably moved initially for those same reasons. I would say the question of housing affordability is going to be a big one. Is the new generation of people who we have here in Minnesota, maybe people who've come from abroad, maybe people who have come out of college and have a lot of debt, are they going to be able to afford the homes? Can they really find a way to afford it for the schools? Maybe, but maybe not. I think that's really going to be a big question for you all.
My point being, if you have differentiated that way, so that this is the place to be, you'll get the people who can't afford it to come.
Oh yeah, there'll be people who can afford it.
So maybe the state will lose out always.
Yeah. There's plenty of people around. Yeah, I would say that. I would say that you have a lot of people that you can draw from in the community. You're in a growing community. It's projected, in the 7-county metro is projected to continue to grow. And so your challenge will be, how do we continue to have a community that works for new residents of Shoreview, wherever they are, whatever their needs might be? Schooling is always going to be big. We just know that.
There's all kinds of other things.
Yeah. That's a big one. And that's one that you'll want to be thinking about, how do we protect that as one of our resources. Yeah.
As a demographer, do you see, you mentioned a trend earlier that millennials especially are waiting to marry later in life, and having smaller families if they're having children at all. Do you see that trend continuing for many years? Is there any way to predict that?
I've never seen in any of the demographic data that I've looked at, I've never seen really a big reversal in the birth trends declining. It's all towards fewer kids. That's not to say it couldn't happen. The baby boom itself was really a pretty unusual phenomenon, a very unusual phenomenon. So it sure could happen that we would see a reversal. But when you look country to country, state to state, population group to population group, you see a movement toward fewer kids across the board. And so I guess if we did see a turnaround, it would surprise me.
And is that also a trend in immigrant populations? Years ago, immigrant families tended to be a lot, they believed in having kids and populating.
Yeah. What we see typically is that the first generation coming have larger families and look much more like their families from the country where they were born. But you see, especially right now, Hispanic or Latino young people in their 20s, their family sizes look very much like US born, if they came here when they were young or even were born here. Very low fertility rates. And so what we've seen in terms of Hispanic or Latino fertility, for example, birth rates in the last 5 years has been very, very low compared to what it's been historically. And that's just because the people who are reaching those parenthood ages have been here their whole lives. And so their birth patterns look very much like people who were born here if they weren't themselves. So it's a generation thing in terms of immigrants, yeah?
A comment about your question. I would be really curious to see the correlation between birth rates and college tuition rates. Just as those continue to go up.
You don't know?
I don't really foresee those getting overhauled right now anyways, but I have a question about space, and I mentioned it earlier. Do you know of any other areas in the state like ours where we don't have a lot of space to expand? It'll mostly be redevelopment, if anything.
Yeah.
Because I know one thing that Shoreview residents value most is our green space, and I don't think we're willing to give that up. And so what do we do?
Yeah.
Or is anybody else with a similar issue doing it better?
I would say where we are seeing growth of areas that are already built out, largely built out, it's going to be kind of that the suburb outside, you know, the center cities or the second ring maybe. You're seeing more multifamily units and more density over building out green space, I would say. So there's many other communities like that who have experienced robust growth, or even moderate growth. And the growth that you see happening is largely those multi-unit buildings. Yeah.
When you factor your population growth, how do you work into mortality and morbidity rates? Because we keep reading about there's some new disease always around the corner that's going to wipe us out, you know,
Yeah.
things like that. I mean,
So when we make projections about the future, how many people we're going to have and what ages they're going to be, we base it really on what we've seen in the most recent past. And those things have been pretty stable, that we've seen mortality, we've seen life expectancies creep up slowly. We've seen birth rates creep down slowly. And so we build those into our projections. But if there's an event
well, I have read where they expect the generation behind the baby boomers, of which I'm one, well, their life expectancy will be less.
Well, that's
that I don't really understand.
Well, what's happening right now, we've seen this kind of long-term expansion of health and of life expectancy. But it's really the middle-aged population that's seeing higher rates of mortality right now, and that's bringing down the overall, and it really is probably linked to drug epidemics,
Okay.
opioids, yep.
Can we please just the last couple quick
Yep.
questions, because we want to move it to the next one?
Yep.
I know from just conversations in daily life, speaking with people that have been trying to get a home in Shoreview and put in, have been putting in offers, but they're outbid by somebody else who's also looking.
Yeah.
And probably my same demographic, starting out new families and whatnot, and that's what I've been hearing. So I'm curious if you have any information on the newest residents of Shoreview, the people that are coming in, what that demographic is.
Do you have information on that? That's not something I have, and I don't know where you would get it unless you surveyed it specifically.
We don't. Our demographic data.
Thank you. We don't. That's certainly a good question. Our demographic data we have comes from the U.S. Census and the Metropolitan Council, and so it doesn't dive that deep into it. We have done studies in the past where our residents are coming from, and who is coming and essentially who is going. And the data is quite old. It's probably about 15 years old, and I don't really recall, where residents are coming from. I could certainly pull that data and we could put it up online, but just keep in mind that it is older. And I can say that one of the problems Shoreview does have is that we do attract younger families. Typically, they are in our rental communities, and at that point in time, when it came time to purchase a home, they were skipping Shoreview and moving north to Blaine or Lino Lakes, where it was more affordable at that time.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious of people who are buying homes and becoming, I guess, permanent residents of Shoreview, what that demographic looks like.
Yeah, I'll see what I can pull and we can put it up online.
Definitely wouldn't that somewhat reflect by the school data? I mean, our schools are definitely filling back up, so that's got to say something that the people that are moving in there are probably school age, families, and, so that somewhat reflects that, I mean.
It does, and actually Mounds View School District, they do a lot of demographic studies to determine, what their population enrollments will be and what their needs of the students will be.
One more question.
Question on our youth. I believe in your 2015 report, a lot of our youth were seeking higher education outside the state of Minnesota and not returning. Is that trend continuing?
So that's, I kind of touched on our what's happening in Ramsey County too in this. The question was, are we seeing youth leaving Minnesota, and is that continuing after 2015? Oh, this is what I wanted to show you. So that 10,000 moving out of Ramsey County is being led most likely by the young. It's people who are 19, 20, 21, people who are going off to school. And what we've seen in the state is that, yes, it's a consistent pattern that more people leave than come to Minnesota. More young people leave than come here to Minnesota. When we're looking at that state-to-state migration. We fully make up for it in international migration so far, but that's something that's going to be important for all of us going forward is how well do we keep young people.
Situation for our employers.
Yeah, it's important, yeah.
And future families and everything else within the state of Minnesota.
I mean, the vast majority of people stay. Movers are a small proportion, but we'd like to see more people coming than moving away, that's for sure. And we haven't seen that for some time now.
So please join me in thanking Susan Brown. So hi, I'm Gretchen. I'm here to just kind of help facilitate the next part. So as you know, the city is undertaking their comprehensive plan update, and this is why we have you here today to help us think through that, kind of what to include in that planning for our future in Shoreview. So what we're going to do is break up into topics. Each table is going to have a specific topic, and we'd like you to talk among yourselves on that specific topic, how the demographic trends that you saw today might inform that, or some of the things you think are important as it informs the comprehensive planning kind of thinking moving forward. So do you want to put these out?
So if, I see a lot of people in the back, so if you're not at the table, we can have some spaces that's on the table, so feel free to identify.
We're really pleased with the turnout, so thanks everyone for showing up on this beautiful summer night. So there's a piece of paper in the middle, and if someone can kind of just take notes or anybody kind of contribute ideas on the pages, that would be helpful to collect the ideas from you at the end. We'll take about 10, 15 minutes to talk among yourselves, and then we'll have you report out to a larger group of some of your thoughts and ideas, and we'll share with each other kind of what we wanted to suggest. So go ahead, Kathleen. This is a random assignment. You will not be...
Well, you are. Tested?
Pardon me? You won't be tested, right. You're not necessarily expected to be experts on each of these topic areas.
That's a fun topic. You just have to talk about Parks and Rec.
What I'm going to do is walk around and offer the microphone to somebody at each table to share what you were talking about, and here I am at the first table, so they're scrambling to figure out who's the one, who's going to take it.
Okay, so we had, I think, a really tough topic, which is natural resources and resiliency. So about a number of things, and I think we strayed off the topic at times. But just jump in if I'm off here. So one of the first things we talked about is food sources. Food sources can be cultural. For example, I think if you go into the cities, you see more urban gardens being developed by some of the cultural populations there. And then access to food as well. Energy use and making sure that we have alternate sources for energy use and that we're not just relying on fossil fuels. One of the things that did come up was specifically with populations who may be on a fixed income, such as our senior populations, and how do we make energy affordable to those populations. Also recycling and waste management in terms of, I think some populations and whether or not certain complexes like high density apartment complexes are designed to encourage recycling and wise waste management. I think the overall theme there was innovation, just making sure that we're innovative in terms of some of these systems. We talked about impact of populations on our natural resources and the demand that greater populations have on natural resources and the importance of preserving open space and providing trail networks and connections throughout the community. I think what it came down to maybe is what we thought about resiliency was really design a community that would accommodate all generations or mixed generations that would interact with one another.
Excellent. Thanks, you guys. I'm going to move to transportation now, because this was a theme as we were talking with the demographer. I'm going to drop the mic.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
I just happen to talk a lot, I guess, but we were talking a little bit about, at least what struck my fancy was the driverless car discussion. Because I really think that that's going to be true 10 years from now, where, you know, instead of calling an Uber with a person in it that drives you somewhere, you're going to just get a car that comes and picks you up, like, and it's going to turn almost into New York City, right, where something's right there and it pulls up. And what's interesting to me about that is that it's that will be in demand not only for the people that have the uptown kind of lifestyle that, you know, bike around everywhere and do the Ubers, but also the older population that just want to go somewhere a few miles away and can just call a car and it comes. And what's interesting about that is that doesn't make the roads go away, right? We talked a little bit about crime as well, whether, you know, how is that impacted or not by, you know, Metro Transit being nearby, because people can easily come to a place that they're not living in and potentially, you know, have higher crime there. It's, I guess, debatable. I don't know, what other things we want to.
Thanks. So I guess this is a really tough topic that we can't solve in 5 minutes. I know the state's been working on it for a long time, but basically, what can Shoreview do? I mean, from a comprehensive guide plan standpoint, and it's what's our vision. And of course, if driverless cars are going to be coming out, the question is, what can the city do to accommodate them? When you start talking about transportation for a growing elderly population, what kind of needs would that be? And if there are driverless cars, I mean, if you go down that path, that's probably further discussion as to how could those fit into that picture to accommodate an aging population. But there's a lot of assumptions that go into this, and I can see where maybe we need more of a deeper discussion and maybe an understanding of where we think the trends are going and how we can, what needs the city have from a vision statement of how we can accommodate this connection.
Very thoughtful. It's really exciting. We are in a time of a lot of uncertainty or unpredictability for what is really going to take form. So this was a good segue to our public health and public safety and community health. We have the millennial taking the mic.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki. We have public safety and community health, and we talked basically about two subjects. The lower crime rates equal a more attractive community. Just overall, we contract with the 7 contract cities for sheriff's, fire, and ambulance services. And so we talked about how response times, call volume, and how those factor into the budgetary needs of the city. And so as the population ages, there will likely be more calls. How do we do that? And some really great ideas came up about what can be done to prevent calls in the first place. And some ideas that we had were possibly community or individual health checks, checking on your neighbors if they are staying within their homes. Also more nurse staffing in assisted living facilities, if possible, if we can encourage that, if there aren't already. We also talked a little bit about community health as a whole. Our parks and trails system and our green spaces are a huge asset to our community. There are a lot of fitness opportunities, the community activities, also nutrition. We have a farmer's market on Tuesdays. So just, those were a few things. Anybody have anything else that I missed? That's all.
Excellent. Yeah, how do we take care of each other? You know, how do we make sure we're in safe environments, that people are watching out for each other is really an important part of the way communities work. So segue to parks and recreation for the active living folks.
Okay. Well, the three older gentlemen here were all pretty satisfied with our park and rec current system, so they didn't have too much to add. But I personally think it would be nice to have a few more activities offered here at the community center that cater to an older population, maybe people with limited mobility if they need to do exercises or something in a chair rather than, you know, if they can't do some of the more aerobic type things. And also, I've also been a big admirer of the city of Roseville has they're like little small, I don't know what they call them, but they're little buildings like at the park over by Lydia and Hamlin and also at Lexington Park where people can meet, and it's not just a little shack, they're very tastefully done inside. They have fireplaces with the large LED TV screens and a small kitchenette, so it gives people opportunities to meet closer to their homes, maybe with their neighbors, to get together and gather there. So, and let's see if any of these other guys want to mention.
You guys have anything else to add?
I love it. These are really great ideas. I love thinking out of the box and responding to the changing needs of the community and what it is that people need.
They didn't pick up on the change in park and rec activities, the increase in pickleball over.
Pickleball. Oh, yes.
We talked about
How
it.
do we get that happening more? Good point.
We brought that up in our world.
Pickleball, the Shoreview sport. Okay, housing in neighborhoods.
Well, we've had several observations and a few comments for potential. First, it's obvious that our housing stock is aging. Even though it's aging, it's not becoming less expensive. It's becoming more expensive. So that's an observation about the demand, even though what we have. And there's a lack of property for any new homes, and what one sees to buy or to build is very expensive. There is an increase in the high-end apartments. A couple of us know that there are going to be some things in the area of 600 new apartment units coming online in the next couple of years in Shoreview. That means probably 1,000 people in high-end apartments on transportation lines. So there's potential for demand for transportation, which hopefully will have some supply follow that demand. And it also means that somebody that's putting money into that is observing that there's people either working here now that want to use apartments, or there's a potential for bringing more of the younger apartment users into those high-end apartments. Affordable housing is going to be very, very difficult because of the cost of the property, the cost of that we have here. That's going to be an incredibly difficult challenge. So that what we're going to have the opportunities for is why people came here to Shoreview in the first place. They came here because of the educational opportunities, the lakes and open space and the trail systems that we have that are attracting people, and they want a house that has a little more space. It's going to be tough to encourage that micro lot to put Minneapolis-sized lots into Shoreview. Is going to be quite a challenge. There may be some demand in the future, but we don't see around this table at least that demand.
Ken, you guys talking all about the potential for becoming like Edina, where there's tear downs and building of different styles?
Well, we think that that's going to happen with the older stock, but no, we didn't talk about it much. I think that can happen that's going to be with the high amenity lakes areas, the open space areas probably has the greatest potential.
So they're really important observations about what are the potentials for growth and how do you see that fitting into the context of the community, whether there's going to be some of these trends we see in other communities happening, and just trying to get a little bit of a set of projections about that. Okay, that leads to our land use and development.
Yeah, the other kind of piggybacks here, we kind of discussed that our table is unique where we are both new moves to Shoreview here, so what everyone's been talking about. They came from Pennsylvania here, basically moved to Shoreview for the school system. We moved from Colorado, and we're here basically for she wanted the cities, I wanted the water, so this is that middle distance, not too far.
Clearly you won.
Forest Lake would have been too far. but that's, exactly. But we're at, I guess, talking about development here, and now Frank has sat in on some of the development meetings. It sounds like all of the new housing developments have to be multi-family developments over the next handful of years, or are scheduled to be that way, or else they're going to be commercial residential. And from where we come from, I mean, that's the big thing for us is being up here, live in the community, not a lot to do besides the green space. I mean, we kind of like a lot of that charm in the community, and more of a, not say downtown, but an area for everybody to kind of mingle at, per se. So really, granted, it's all just multi-unit, that can decrease, even though it allows people to move up here, can decrease other values of their houses up here. Really, I would think the focus would be making more of the commercial residential areas, because that's really where the trend is at, East Coast and West Coast right now, and around here, a lot of the areas. Seeing that going through, there's a lot of nice areas now, but just need to be cleaned up. They've aged out there to go through, restructure where the commercial is at right now, build them upwards, nice and clean, so there is residential across the top of those, bringing in new restaurants, gathering social businesses with charm. That's what attracts people. That will keep the older population, the younger population here happy with that. So that's a way to really, two birds, one stone there, because when you build upwards and have this part in, you're kind of building different areas of downtowns around the area, and you're attracting all three age groups, because the aging population, we said, they now have a walking distance. They can now come through there. They don't have to take transportation to have a lot more amenities closer. The young families who are coming in right now, it just allows more amenities and more of a social atmosphere, so you don't have to always leave Shoreview to go out to go to eat. We don't have to go down to the cities or somewhere else. It's appealing. And the young, as we talked about, we now offer them some lower price places to rent, and now they will have areas that they can gather and have fun there as well too, and it will get them roots to the area too, so we'll perpetuate and keep the population going through Shoreview here. So,
Excellent.
Our thoughts.
Yeah, how do we keep it really dynamic for a wide range of people? How do we embrace the mixed use strategies to creating places where there's many things to do in an area, more walkable, so you can really enjoy the area. A lot of these principles are really resonating for many places, because this is the kind of places people want to live.
Exactly.
So now we're in economic development. So how do we keep the vitality of the community robust and moving forward? Who's going to take? Here we go. Okay, good.
So we are actually a large group here, and all of us are pretty close by in our neighborhood. We actually live pretty much on this block. And we have been talking about some areas of opportunity that we have noticed in this neighborhood. We have a variety of different lengths of time that we've been living in this neighborhood, and we've noticed that there are some businesses that could probably see some growth, some improvement, some areas that have businesses such as the Shoreview Mall. Maybe there are some opportunities there. It's pretty close to both than 96, so leading right into St. Paul and Minneapolis, Roseville, all of these other areas. Could we see some redevelopment on top of that site? If there are some more opportunities for business. Most of the time you see the parking lot, it's not that full over there. So if we are a community that's looking for space, where is it? Well, it's there, where that empty space already is. What can we do to change that and use that to a better purpose? Because we have a lot of active families that are already using some of the space that else could be looked at as redevelopment area.
Terrific. We got one more contributor here.
I want to make a quick public service announcement. My name is Bill Satari. I'm a new member of the Shoreview Economic Development Commission, and we are all, Jeff over there at the table, we met on Monday, kind of started talking about, again, over the next 17 months, what are we going to do to add to the comprehensive plan and keep this community very vibrant. So I guess we want to hear what everybody has to say. I think we have a population of, 26,000 people. I'm fine with hearing from 26,000 people because I think that's going to make us a stronger community. So I don't have a business card yet. I think it'll be the next meeting. I'll get it. But if you want to engage in a conversation with me or with Jeff, I think he's okay with me giving out his location there. Feel free to stop by after the meeting and we can keep the conversation going.
Terrific. Yeah, lots of people want to kind of get everyone's thoughts. I would love it if you could leave behind your paper, if you've been able to take some notes, because we want to make sure this gets documented and informing the comprehensive planning process. Do you want to take the...
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate your input. It's important for us as a city to get input from members of the general public as we go through this comprehensive planning process. So next community conversation is August 10th, and it's on land use and development, so same room. I'm hoping that you can return and attend that event as well. I think we have something exciting planned for that. Also just want to let you know that information on our comprehensive planning process can be found on our website, shoreviewmn.gov. We're actually developing a specific page for that called destination.shoreviewmn.gov, and you'll be able to see information on all of the community conversations we're having at taped here tonight. That'll be available online. And we also have a video animation series which will have surveys that you can fill out, short surveys. They won't take too much of your time. So certainly feel free to visit the page and participate that way as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.